Welcome to Decoding Leadership. I'm really excited to have Charity Majors on the show this week. Charity is probably the person least in need of introduction of all the guests I've had on the show. She got her start at the company behind Second Life and then has worked at a number of different companies since then, including Parse, which was acquired by Facebook. And she was one of the co-founders of Honeycomb. She's been there for the last 10 years and has been quite influential in the observability space. She's even responsible for the term observability. And she's also has written very thoughtfully about a number of topics. I always look forward to her writing. She has written about observability, the tech industry, leadership, being an engineer, ops, a lot of different topics. And she often has a perspective that just really gets at the heart of the matter and is kind of like a unique perspective. I always look forward to what she has to say. So today we get to experience that firsthand. I'm really excited to have this conversation with her and to share it with you. So it's been almost 10 years since you and Christine founded Honeycomb, and a lot has changed in the world. Like, it's a very different environment for leaders nowadays. A lot of those things are not for the better. Like, we're in this post-ZIRP era. We're going through layoff frenzies. There's this political kind of early fascist era that we're part of. I guess I'm curious, like, what you think. Like, do you think there's room for humane leadership in the world today? And how is that different versus 10 years ago?
More than ever, people are hungry for this. People will give up money to join companies with people they believe in, like lots of money. I really believe that having ideals and ethics can be an enormous advantage in business. The caliber of talent that you attract, the loyalty, the we're in it together sort of feeling is, I honestly think, one of the deepest, most consistent experiences of being human.
Yeah.
Is of wanting to search for meaning and wanting to be part of organizations that are big. You want to feel like you're a small piece of something much bigger than yourself. And I think there was a time when, if you really wanted to change the world, you would go into government or nonprofits, right? And honestly, all that stuff is so dysfunctional now. If you want to change the world, I think you should go into business. I would never say that everything's perfect or universally great or even universally getting better, but there's so much enormous room for variation. The ZIRP thing, I honestly think post-ZIRP, what's hard about this is the boom and bust cycle. I actually think that the ZIRP itself was terrible for technology, in particular when it comes to being good leaders and thinking about what makes for good teams. Hypergrowth, the inflationary, just like no resource matters except time, was terrible for us.
Yeah.
And so correction is brutal. I actually think we're having to grow up very fast. We're having to mature very fast as leaders, but it's long overdue and very welcome to me.
Yeah, no, I hear you on that. It's funny you mention like the competitive advantage of having a workplace that is both effective and humane. I remember there was a time like several years ago when it honestly felt like every single engineering leader I knew was looking not for a job, but for a job at a company that they felt wasn't a shitty company. And it was just remarkable to me. It was like so uniform. Like, basically, I had so many people coming to me being like, do you know any companies that aren't terrible? And it's interesting that that isn't considered as like a strategy for building a sustainable long-term business. It's often not perceived as like a benefit. And yet, often the way you build sustainability in a company is by building in what works for humans. I guess I'm kind of curious about like, what pressures do you see on senior leadership that cause them to ignore this or cause them to create terrible companies?
It's become much more common these days for people to just be like, all I want is a paycheck. I want a strict separation between my work. And I get why that backlash is coming, because for so long, there's been this asymmetry in commitment. Employers asking for their employees to be all in, give us everything, and they feel no loyalty to them in return. So why wouldn't you be cynical? But I feel that's not what I want for myself. I want to give. We spend a third of our lives at work. It should be something. I feel like it's a better life when there's meaning in your work. But I feel like the calculus is different for ICs than for leaders. And the more senior of a leader, I think you can do great work as an IC, putting in your 40 hours, not thinking about for varying definitions. I think that can work really well. As a leader, I think you can't do a good job for the company if you aren't aligned on what it means to do a good job, which means ethics and the term shit umbrella, I think is, I've heard a lot of managers say like, my job is to be a shit umbrella. And I always cringe. I'm like,
me too.
You're not doing anyone any favors. You're working at cross purposes with what your leaders want. And that's not actually good for anyone. There's actually also a lot of leaders who talk about and really mean their priority is people. And the problem is they then end up not succeeding in business because you have to do both. And part of this is knowing the rules of the game. I feel like anytime I hear someone at a young startup who's like, oh, what I really want in life is stability, I'm like, ooh, you're playing the wrong game. You're not, what you want and the place that you've put yourself are not in alignment, right? If what you want is stability, predictability, which there's no shame in that, but like you should put yourself in a place that also values those things. For leaders who are towards the top of the stack in particular, for people who are hiring those people, there's a whole lot of, you see what they've done previously, and you project that forwards. When a lot of people were just kind of along for the ride, when push comes to shove, if you have to choose between success at business or ethics and treating people well, your leadership will choose success at business. And so those of us who care deeply about both, I think the bar is even higher for us to show that we can make hard decisions, we can hold people to high standards, we can be clear with everyone on what that means, and then we don't treat it like it's either or, because that's what leads to it becoming either or. Am I making sense?
I love that framing. If there is a choice in business, you know how it's always going to go.
You are legally, there have been Supreme Court cases. You have to do what is good for the business. You are not allowed to, now in the nearer term or in the midterm, there are trade-offs, right?
Yes.
That's where judgment comes in.
Yeah.
You don't always do what's best for the business, or you will actually cripple your business in the long run, because short-term interests are different than long-term interests.
Exactly.
This is hard. And everyone's a critic.
Yeah.
So I feel like this is part of why, if you aspire to upper leadership, and I kind of wish more people would, I think it's become kind of, nobody wants to talk about wanting power because it sounds like a sociopath thing to do.
Yeah.
But I think that there's nothing wrong with wanting power. It's deeply human. What matters is what you do with it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I like the framing of that also, because it's a lot of times sustainability comes about through creating a system that actually works for human beings. And so it's kind of those two dimensions is what creates like sustained success for businesses. And I kind of feel like we shortchange ourselves if we only focus on, just the things that feel good for us as humans, or just the business results. It's kind of like intersection of those two things that makes it all work. Like the truly great companies. Yeah.
Yesterday with our director of security. I'm a big fan of flex time off. I hate it when people say unlimited. I think that's just false advertising. Yeah, it's not unlimited.
It's a lie.
Everybody knows it's not unlimited.
Yeah.
But there are some roles in the company who need more PTO than others because it's more intense. They have more on call. They're more reactive. They're more, and they were talking about how they've like, I've done the math. I've had to report to CFOs who didn't believe this, so I did the math. It works out better for you in the long run to give them more time off so that they don't get burned out and leave, and you have to turn over your employees every 18 months.
I love that.
It is better it takes a leader to bridge that gap and speak both languages to both sides. I also get why so many employees are so cynical about flex time off. Mm-hmm. They're like, oh, companies would only do this because they don't want to pay out. And there have absolutely been companies who have done it for that reason.
Yeah.
I really believe one of our company values is we hire adults. And the reality is adults have complicated lives,
Hmm.
roles, people go through time periods where, and I would rather bake it into the expectations that we have high standards for people. We try to be outcome oriented, but it would be stupid for us to be like, oh, well, this person who's been here and been a high performer for 3 years, but they're having 6 months of like health problems or family issues, or they can't, like, we're going to have, like, no,
Yeah.
you be flexible.
You and I had a conversation recently where we talked about the value of creating like institutions and creating companies specifically that are valuable, that you want to devote yourself to. Why do you think that is worthwhile or worth pursuing, or like why do you find meaning in that as your goal? Like what helped you identify that as important to you?
I want my work to be worthwhile. I want it to be worth doing. I want it to have a meaning. In my life, I've been, I think, so lucky. You and I both have been here through, I think, the golden age of tech. Like, it's gotten harder to get in. It's gotten harder to get up. There's, some of these reasons, like, these were not largely nefarious reasons. I mean, you saw the same thing happen with radio and TV and like early days. There's just so much opportunity in the early days when nobody knows what they're doing. Tech was a toy when you and I got started, right? Now it runs nuclear power plant. Of course, it's gotten harder, and so many of the hurtful patterns out in the world, the things that really grind people down, these largely came about just because a company that was doing them ended up making a lot of money. And so people look at them and copy what they did. And I just feel like, wow, there's opportunity here to build a company that succeeds and does things better, because then people will copy you, right? Like, if you really want your ideals to succeed, everyone's a fucking critic. Like, it's not hard to sit on the outside and throw stones. I personally love being a critic. I really loved like critiquing everyone on Twitter back when that was cool.
Yeah.
But it doesn't actually change things. I think if you really care about your ideals, want them to succeed, the best thing you can do is show that they can be successful.
Yeah. Well, when I think about the legacy of some really like old and kind of like boring companies like Intel or HP, like,
The ones that pioneered giving engineers stock options to this day.
yeah,
No other industry does this.
yeah.
How amazing is that?
And what a difference it's made in so many people's lives. And like those companies have like influenced the practices like quite broadly. Um,
Yeah.
and and so I have this part of me that's like, oh my God, that work was so amazing and so impressive and so like it was like boring work in a way
Yes.
that
Yes.
really
It's
affected a
boring.
huge amount of people.
Yes.
And yet
Not
I
and you
also
never know which parts of the work are going to matter. You never know.
right, right. So like, Honeycomb pioneered this idea of having a employee on the board, and fascinating experiment. Like I love that you're using your innovation tokens on something like that. I think it's just a wonderful idea. Um, but I also think about like there's a lot of people that get a lot of attention and people copy their approaches even though they're not necessarily effective. I haven't, I've talked to so many leaders, especially startup leaders, who really aim to emulate Elon Musk. They think Elon Musk is the best manager ever. And, and then before him, it was like Steve Jobs. And, there's a lot of good and bad about Steve Jobs, but
AWS, dude.
right, exactly. Um, Usually those conversations don't have a lot of nuance to them. But
Fun.
I guess how do you kind of balance building these effective institutions with the fact that like attention also kind of rules a lot? Is it partially about getting attention for the successes, or is it more about just how many people we affect, or like what's your thought about that?
That's an interesting question. I will point out as a bit of an aside, um, uh, the woman who wrote Radical Candor,
Yeah.
Kim Scott,
Hmm.
back when Founder Mode was going off,
Yeah.
she wrote an opinion piece for the New York Times about how, all these YC folks and Brian Chesky are talking about Steve Jobs this. Even Steve Jobs grew up. Like, that was shit he said early in his career. By the end of his career, he's like, look, we hired you for your brilliance. We don't know as much as you. He was talking about his frontline workers, right?
Yeah.
And so where we choose to focus our attention is so revealing, I think.
Yeah.
Um, I do think, that saying, behind every great fortune is a great crime. I am not convinced you can become a billionaire without doing a lot of crimes. Um, but I absolutely think you could become a millionaire by appealing to the better angels of people's name. There's such a huge amount of room for variance, right, in the middle of that. And so I think an interesting sort of case study for the type of stuff you're talking about is Honeycomb. We never tried really to publicize our culture early on, but the fact that we had 2 female co-founders is why a lot of people came to work for us. Now, I didn't love this. I receive it as the gift it is, but it's kind of like someone saying they want to date you because you're a woman. You're just kind of like,
Yeah.
is there anything else about me that you like? Like, it's a little bit of a two-handed, backhanded compliment or whatever.
Yeah.
But I think you stand up by trying to do something different if it's something that appeals to people, The other thing that we have just had an embarrassment of riches when it comes to hiring just incredible people. Like, it's a little embarrassing. Even back when hiring was tight, we would have hundreds of applicants for, and one of the other things was we wrote early on about our interviewing practices and our hiring practices. And we were just like, we don't know if this is better, but here are mistakes that we hated. So we're going to try to make new mistakes, right? So here's our process. And that, like, I wrote one blog post in 2017 that was still making the rounds, like, recently, I feel like, and this actually happens in ways that I think are very revealing of what people want to hear, even if they aren't actually great. I think that there are some places that make these really, like, strong stances about DEI or whatever that actually don't work very well or don't, so you kind of have to walk it back, so I don't know that I'm a fan of, like, once you advertise something, you're so committed to it. Once you make something an ethical question, it raises the stakes. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. I was very, very vigorously like, you should pay everyone at your company, the same wage brackets, right?
Yeah.
It's immoral to give 2 people who are doing the same job a different salary if they live in different places of the world.
Yeah.
I still agree that is a strong preference of mine.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a similar preference, but I also see that there are trade-offs in that.
You're like, and it is, to be clear, our policy at Honeycomb, and we have no intention of changing it anytime in the near future.
Yeah.
But I've had to think a lot. I no longer think this is necessarily an easy ethical slam dunk. By having a remote first culture, you make some sacrifices, and you hope that you can make this work by having, benefits in other ways. And one of these is money. And I don't think it's unethical to be like, in order to be able to hire more people, distribute these opportunities more widely, etc., we are going to try to pay people very fairly and everything, but it's going to be, there's a lot more nuance there. But having taken this very public stance, I've made it so hard for anyone in the future to ever try and do anything different,
Oh, interesting. That is really interesting. So it kind of sounds like you're advocating for us to just kind of share our learnings with each other more.
Share what works.
Yeah.
But with more of a stance of ideological humility than certainty.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
You know?
I feel like that nuance is something that we need a lot more of, and especially in leadership circles where it's much more about like, okay, what was the context? What did we learn from
What
this?
was the context? I wish every single leadership talk
Yeah.
I ever saw came with, here is the context in which this works. Because that's half
Yeah.
half of what you need to know.
Yeah. And how much of this is aspirational?
And how much are you actually doing versus how much you think the world should work this way?
Yeah.
Because I can agree with you. And also,
Yeah, exactly. And so we have a lot of these very persistent kind of management memes around like Spotify and Netflix and how all these companies operate that
Yeah.
you know even like the Basecamp shape up stuff. Well, there is a very specific context that like there's a lot of wisdom in those practices, and that was done in a very specific context,
Very specific
like
context.
that
Mhm.
maybe doesn't make sense for everybody. There might be some things you can steal from it. What parts might be the most stealable?
I don't know what specifically where the outcomes would be very useful. Not just it was better, everyone is happy.
Yeah,
I don't actually believe you now.
yeah,
What did you have to give up to get this? One of the things that I think employees are often, and I think that I struggled with in the past is like, I- so if you choose to compensate current employees and stock, whatever, high, um, who is suffering as a result? I
mm,
think something that I have learned is often it is future employees that are suffering
right.
because it's actually a fixed. It's not. I think a lot of times employees are like, "Oh, this will come out of the VC's bucket." No,
That's not
it's
the way it
coming out of
works.
other employees'
Yeah,
bucket. And to your point about the putting an employee on our board, it was a very interesting experiment. But is an interesting experiment, and it. I understand now why it's not something that companies typically do.
yeah,
Uh, Mostly because nobody actually understands what the board does
yeah,
or cares about. No matter how many times we tell them,
yes,
no matter how many times, and there's a picture in people's mind of what it means. And boards actually talk about and care about none of the things
yeah.
that employees think they do or care about. They don't care. They don't think about this thing. They don't care about it. And it's just like we spend most of our time just trying to communicate that, honestly. Um, and I wish we lived in a world where it was the kind of thing but it's not.
Yeah.
And it's more symbolic than anything. And as such, I don't think it means nothing.
Yeah.
But Liz was the person who introduced me to this concept, and it's 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 table stakes in much of Europe. It's mandatory in some countries.
Right.
They were trying to. The reason she left Google was ultimately because they refused to put it in place. And I think that would have had an incredible impact
Yeah.
if, as one of our board members pointed out, if it didn't just mean that all the important conversations got driven to the hallways, which it could.
It could very well happen.
Hasn't happened with us, mostly just because what the employee board member cares about and what the board cares about are such a disjoint set. Like they don't overlap. So we've had board members that we really trust, so they're present, but like it's not a conversation that they're like participating in.
Yeah.
So it's subtle, man. It's all really subtle.
One thing I'm hearing you say that I haven't really thought about before is just how much of like leadership sometimes exists as an abstraction for employees. Like they don't really necessarily understand like geocomp and the trade-offs of that and how that affects where you can hire, or they don't think about equity packages, or even how promotion budgets might come out of the same pool as your hiring budget, and what the trade-offs are of like choosing different policies there.
Right?
Yeah.
That's a dense body of work. It's not interesting to a lot of people, and
No.
everyone has a fixed amount of attention and time to care.
Yeah.
For one thing, this is why I love the engineer manager pendulum. I
Yeah.
love having senior ICs who have been managers before.
Yeah.
They're so often the most fraught times in an organization are times when management legally, ethically can't actually talk about what's going on. You
Yeah.
can't say anything.
Yeah.
And having people who have been managers before who can speculate in an informed way about what's probably or might be going on behind the scenes is so reassuring, comforting, valid. It's good. Management's like, okay, great. They're taking the temperature down. ICs are like, oh, that makes sense. I never thought about that. Oh, you're right.
Yeah.
And the former managers can be like, the question is, do we trust our management or not? Have we seen them act ethically? Because they can't talk about this, right?
Yeah.
And I just feel like having that bridge pays dividends.
Yeah.
And like, I get why so many people are so cynical these days, and it makes it easy not to trust. I, on a deep personal level, believe in transparency. Like I have been when I was at Parse, I worked my heart out for that company. I loved it. The founders were never straight with me or us about, they just weren't straight with us. They, and I think YC really kind of encourages a real, you're a founder or you're not,
Right.
and the inner circle is the founders and everyone, like they were like so narrowly baffling and I could have done such a better job for them if they were just like, we're afraid that Facebook's gonna shut Parse down because there's no reason. If they had just been like, they probably assumed that I was putting that together. I did not.
No.
Ever.
Yeah.
Ever.
Yeah.
And I look back and it gives me a lot of sympathy. For like I think we assume that things are. They're not.
Yeah.
They haven't spent time thinking about the business reasons and all this stuff. And they're brilliant people and they care, but like most of the time, no, they can't intuit,
Yeah.
And so I have these very strong opinions about if you're spending a third of your life like the company it owes you things, right?
Yeah.
And I have had to modulate that or adjust that as it was grown. And I have also started to realize it's not, are we transparent? Do they deserve it? It's how much is distracting to them? What's going to derail them?
Yeah.
What is going to be terrifying to them because they don't actually understand the consequences or that these are just the ups and downs. We can't tell them every time a VC is like, oh, you guys are never going to blah, blah, blah. People flip their shit.
No, they're terrified.
Buffer that.
Yeah.
We need to buffer that. Take the lumps, so many times employees, engineers in particular, will be like, here's a problem. You guys aren't being transparent with us. You need to tell us more. And it's like, y'all, we have told you this.
Yeah.
We have laid all of this out
Yeah.
so many times. And honestly, this year in our yearly offsite, one of the things we said was that we were going to be more transparent by sharing less, but in more structured and predictable ways.
Oh, interesting.
When you drown people in narrative,
Yeah.
instead of giving this like 30-minute presentation on financials every quarter or every month, we put a slide in Slack, it has like 5 lines and they're color coded. This is the financials.
Right.
And it's the same predictable format month over month, right?
Yeah.
And they're, oh, that's red, And so I think we're sharing less information,
Yeah.
but it's landing more with people.
That's great. I love that. It's kind of about focusing, because often like the information climate in a company is just bewildering. It's really hard to make sense of things. And I personally I've really appreciated times in the past where leaders have contextualized things and just kind of explained like, oh, well, this is kind of the way it happens when you go through an acquisition, or this is what happens when, you take another round of funding. Basically, these are the sets of expectations. This is how things work. And, a lot of people just don't know those things. There's no reason they should. It takes a lot of kind of sense making and explanation. But it's hard because you can also spend like all your time doing that.
All your time doing that.
Yeah. So I have this weird theory about kind of like capitalism and some of the things we've been seeing. And it kind of relates to you talking about like this golden age of tech. And I kind of am not totally satisfied with this theory. And I'd love it if maybe you can poke some holes in it or respond to it in some way. And that is like that with capitalism, we have these like bubbles of abundance. And when we have these, when you're in one of those little bubbles, there's a lot of room for creating a great work culture and being effective. There's a lot of room for everything. And
everybody gets all the toys.
Yeah. And then like gradually over time, like capitalism kind of tends to squeeze, like the competition kind of squeezes an environment until there's less and less, there's more scarcity. Yeah. And then we get into our like enshittification and other things that seem to be happening. I like how you framed it as like that requires more of us as leaders if we want to create like great workplaces. But do you think that necessarily creates worse work cultures?
I think that not everyone enjoys the growth phase. There's a lot of resources, but there's also a lot of uncertainty. And
Yeah.
I think a lot of people are attracted to it because, money, but like, I could do a whole show about people's expectations when it comes to comp. I think that the days of expecting your compensation levels to go up from the moment that you graduate until the moment you retire is just like, you can't expect that and expect, to be very much in demand when you're 30 years into your career, because there's a trade-off there. There's only limited resources, there's hard place rock thinking there going on. And I think that I also feel like a lot of folks who are so cynical and hate capitalism so much don't understand how much their expectations of the world come from a time of growth and abundance.
Yeah.
I honestly, I've never heard someone who used to be dirt poor growing like me really hate capitalism, because I think we have such an appreciation for what wealth brings,
Absolutely.
and we know what it's like to live without it. And so we're like, yeah, I hear you about the critiques on capitalism. And also,
It's
wealth
amazing.
is nice, and
Yeah.
it is what enables a lot. There's a lot of research that's been done. The time of civil rights and everything comes at a time when opportunities are expanding and people feel comfortable and safe. And
Yeah.
anyway,
Yeah.
yeah. But to your point about, is this inevitable? There was actually an essay a friend forwarded to me because he knew I would love it so much. They were talking about the enshittification of work. And they're like, management is responsible for discipline to resist enshittification. Like, if you think about the way you treat people who are applying for a job now, or you do performance reviews now, versus the way you did it 5 years ago in the middle of the Great Resignation, what is the delta there? Because some companies have just been like, they don't respond to people who are applying, they fire people fast, and this is never, I don't think you can expect it to be treating people identically. Like, if you're like, I don't know, it's going to take us years to backfill this spot, you'll probably try harder to hang on to a low performer just because it's better than nothing. But like, I do feel like that's such an important part, because it is a question of discipline. It is not inevitable. Something I love and appreciate so much about Cory Doctorow's writing is that he says this straight up: it is not inevitable, right? The ecosystem of regulations, ethics, you can hold the line against this tendency to drift, but it requires discipline, and it requires, the first thing that you brought up when we started talking was support from the top. You can't be a manager resisting enshittification alone.
Yeah.
Right? It requires backup, like all the way up the leadership chain. You all have to be like, this is how we treat people. These are our responsibilities to people. And then you can have very pragmatic decisions about, what to do in specific cases, but you treat everyone with respect, right? You give everyone clear communication. You give people the opportunity to improve. You don't just go, we can probably find something better. Let's, trash them and roll the dice. Like, I absolutely reject the idea that it's inevitable.
Yeah. And I would also say that sometimes even individuals that are not at the very top can have a lot of influence on that.
Especially in tech.
Especially in tech.
One of the things I love so much about this industry is the power that can be wielded by people who do the work.
Yeah. I was working on an analytics product at a previous company, and we were weighing adding a feature that would have been really valuable for like advertisers, but would have had some really negative privacy implications. And there was an engineer that was just like, this is such a bad idea. And they really pushed back pretty hard on it and gave really good arguments for it. And we all just kind of looked at each other and were like, wow, we were really kind of thinking about going forward with this.
Yes.
And this is actually kind of a bad idea. Let's just drop this. And we all just, that was the end of it. And I just remember being so impressed with that engineer's kind of core and ability to make the arguments and that was very significant, I thought. Yeah.
I think Google is the example I go to in my mind that has held the line for so long. Not quite so much in the most recent years, but that's part of why it's so tragic.
Yeah.
Because for so long, they valued ICs, they valued the ethical, and the engineers, not just engineers, but like people who worked there took it so seriously,
Yeah.
took that responsibility so seriously, and they put in the work, they developed the arguments, they held the line, because it is not inevitable, but I think it is a drift.
You've worked at companies large and small. You've also been at Honeycomb, which has grown over time. And some of what I see as the challenges in companies are problems that are kind of like humans at scale problems. It's kind of like if you have distributed systems, they're much more problematic than if you just have simple systems. But a lot of them are also like very influenced by leadership, and are often even caused by leadership. I'm curious, like, how your perception of that has changed over time, or in working at these different size companies. Like, how much weight do you ascribe to each of these two elements?
I think everyone walks around with kind of a mental model of where hierarchy is such a animal, mammal, thing. Like I have really had a hard time making my peace with this, because I am someone who just by nature wants to violently flip over every hierarchy I've ever seen. So it's really weird to be like near the top of one.
Yeah.
But it's a very human thing to want to do things that we think will please people who are above us in the hierarchy, and it's instinctive. We all have it. It's nothing to be ashamed of, but and so the more people have a mental model of what you would want them to do, I think if you can sort of convey not just what you care about, but why you care about it, because by default, I think people are just going to assume that you just want to make money, that you just want to, it has really surprised me at times, things that people will assume that we wanted, I read somewhere, if you're a perfectionist, if you're uncomfortable with like something being wrong or you should not go into senior leadership, because once you get tasked, there is never going to be a moment when someone isn't doing something that would be absolutely distressing to you, and you have to learn to like calibrate.
That's so true.
Accept that. Know what the sort of the threshold is.
Yeah.
Not overreact when you find out about it, because it exists whether or not you know about it, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's funny. So much of being a leader, the larger your org gets, the more there's an element of performance. It's not just being authentic to whatever you think or feel. It's also being aware that people are watching you, whether or not they're aware of it, or watching you, and they're reading shit into what you're saying and doing. And you want to be intentional with what that. You have to make snap judgments based on very little information, because there's no other. And I hated this. I mean, when I showed up at Facebook, I did not have a good attitude, and I was very resistant. And there were like these people who were making these big snap judgments about me, and I was angry about it. And in retrospect, I'm like, oh, I should have. What else were they going to make a decision off of, right?
Yeah.
They had like 2 impressions of me. They formed an opinion. They acted on it. I probably should have made sure those impressions were slightly better than they were. Not because but they're managing thousands of people. Of course they're gonna,
Yeah.
and then finding the line between performativeness and authenticity, when that's just like an immutable law of reality,
Oh,
is
yeah.
hard.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating.
One of the hardest things, if you're someone who cares about people and you find yourself going into leadership and management, one of the hardest things to learn to do is it is your job to treat people like resources. It's not your whole job, but it's a huge part of it. My coworker, our VP of engineering, Emily, has written some pieces about this that I loved so much. One of the first blog posts she ever wrote was about it's called Power Bends Light. And she was talking about her experiences when she first became a manager, and how everyone started laughing at her jokes. And at first she was just like appalled and offended. I'm no funnier than I was last month.
Yeah.
Why are you sucking up to me? Right. And just kind of coming to terms with, oh, this is just the nature of the power infused relationship. They're paying more attention to me. They're more predisposed. It just is what it is. Right.
Yeah.
And then when she wrote her series about becoming a VP for the first time, she talked about how rewarding it is to sit in church, to be one small member of a larger whole instead of the one who people are always looking at, right? And I don't think becoming a CEO is an inevitable side to sociopathy, but I think that it is, again, the default, the drift in a self-protective way. It takes so much out of you, and you can act. I think sometimes I was thinking Obama was president, I think, at the time when I tweeted that, and I was just like, how does he do it?
Yeah.
You can't carry this around with you without it affecting who you are. And
Yeah.
to some extent, that's all of our jobs. I was a very different human being when I was working as an engineer than I am after having been a founder for almost a decade. I was a different person. I could read fiction as an engineer. I have always struggled to do that when I'm a manager because there are too many emotions, there are too many feelings. It just
Yeah.
takes too much out of me. Only read nonfiction, But I think that the last thing we want is for only people who are comfortable being sociopaths to become CEOs.
Totally.
The ripple effects of just being an ethical, moral, imperfect person in a position of power is massive, larger than I think you can ever add up or like put your finger on. I think we need people who care about finding this balance in senior leadership roles. And so I think looking for ways, like I love what Emily said about, more of a position of power I'm in, the more I look for balancing experiences where I'm just one of the crowd. I think that's so fucking profound.
I love that. Yeah, for me, I find that there's kind of forces pushing on both sides. Like there's a way in which going into leadership, actually, I feel really has made me like, I would say a better person. I've learned how to communicate better. I've learned how to have hard conversations. I've learned how to like look at situations with a lot more nuance. And like my list for that would be pretty endless. And at the same time, there is also like some of the things that make you more effective are also about like, okay, what does this situation require? Like absent the ethics or whatever, like what does the company need to survive? Like what needs to change? Sometimes that can mean a whole department disappearing or something really, kind of horrible, but you kind of have to be able to hold both of these things at the same time as a leader. And I find that combination just so fascinating.
I think you and I were having this conversation before, but like I am someone, you said you called yourself a believer by nature.
Yeah.
I love that. I am not. I am a bomb thrower. I am a hater. I am a fundamentalist. I want to find absolute answers and like fuck the mushy middle.
Yeah.
And if I hadn't gotten into leadership, I think that's my natural. And running a company has forced me to acknowledge the incredible complexity of reality and the fact that reality doesn't really give a shit what your ideology is. It can inform what needs to happen, but it can't. There's no such thing as a set of ethics that will tell you what to do that's right. No, reality doesn't really give a shit. I've had so many of the strong, powerful convictions I had about how I just have not survived the encounter with reality. And I actually, it's been a real sadder but wiser, I don't have children, never wanted to have children. I think a lot of people find this sort of like relationship with reality when they have children, but my work has really done this for me. I feel like it's made me an adult, finally.
I love that. I think that's a wonderful kind of place to put a period at the end of this. Charity, I feel like this is a weird thing to say to you, but like, if people are looking for you on the internet, where should they go?
Charity.wtf is my blog. I'm also on Blue Sky at charity.wtf. I'm still on Twitter at Mitzi Dipsy, but I don't show up there much. I'm on LinkedIn. And of course, if you're looking for great observability, always check out honeycomb.io.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This has been so much fun. Really had a good time.